Welcome to Revenge Diaries. I'm Sarah. Today we'll hear stories of people who turn the tables. Stay with me. I live in a quiet, tree-lined suburb in the house I spent 30 years paying for, a retired school teacher who finally thought she could enjoy her garden and her books. For decades, I poured every ounce of my love and my savings into my only son, Mark, believing that family was a bond that no amount of money could ever break. But I recently learned that to some people, a mother isn't a person, she's just a piece of equity waiting to be liquidated. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The fragile facade. The concern started small. It began with Mark and his wife, Chloe, coming over for Sunday dinners and pointing out things I hadn't noticed. A slightly overgrown hedge was proof I couldn't maintain the property. A missed step on the porch was a sign that my balance was failing. Mark, who had always been a bit reckless with his business ventures, suddenly became an expert on geriatric safety. "Mom, we just worry," he'd say, exchanging a look with Chloe, who spent the whole dinner scrolling through Zillow on her phone. "This house is too big. What if you fall? What if the stove stays on? You're 65, not 25. I wasn't infirm. I taught 30 children a day for 35 years, I knew how to handle a stove. But the pressure was relentless. They brought brochures for the Heritage Oaks, a place they described as a resort, but I knew it for what it was. A nursing home. They spoke about downsizing and simplifying my life. Mark's business was failing, I knew that much from my brother, James, and the house I owned outright was worth nearly $1 million in the current market. The facade of love was thin, and I was starting to see the cracks, the forced exit. The day they moved me out felt like a funeral where I was the only one mourning. Mark and Chloe arrived with a crew of movers, acting with a frantic energy that they masked as efficiency. They didn't ask what I wanted to keep, they decided what would fit in my new, cramped room. My mahogany desk, where I'd graded thousands of papers, was labeled trash. My garden tools were sold on Facebook Marketplace before I'd even packed my suitcases. "Don't worry, Mom," Chloe chirped, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. "Think of the social life you'll have. Bingo, crafts, and no more worrying about the roof." As Mark pulled the car away from the curb, I looked back at my home. I saw him pocketing my spare key with a smirk he thought I couldn't see. I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. I wasn't going to a resort, I was being evicted by my own blood so they could fund a lifestyle they hadn't earned. I stayed silent, clutching my purse, playing the part of the confused, aging mother they wanted me to be, the hidden truth. Life at the nursing home was exactly as I feared, regulated, sterile, and lonely. However, it gave me one thing I hadn't had at home, anonymity. People assume that because you're in a facility, your hearing and your brain have stopped working. 2 weeks into my stay, Mark and Chloe visited. They didn't come to my room, they stood in the hallway near the nurse's station, thinking I was in the common room for nap time. "The listing goes live on Friday," Mark whispered, his voice vibrating with excitement. "The realtor says if we stage it right, we'll get 20% over asking. We can finally pay off the business debt and put a down payment on that place in the Hamptons." "And your mom?" Chloe asked, though she didn't sound concerned. "She's fine here. She signed the power of attorney, didn't she? She's out of the way. She'll never even know the house is gone until the check clears." I stood behind the door, my hand trembling, not from age, but from a cold, sharp rage. They weren't just moving me, they were erasing me, the paper trail. The next morning, I sought out Nurse Linda. She was a no-nonsense woman who saw right through the poor old lady act I'd been putting on. "Linda," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I need a favor, a phone, and a very good lawyer." Linda listened as I explained the situation. She had seen this 100 times. Children dumping parents to strip their assets. She helped me contact my brother, James. As a corporate tax consultant, James knew exactly how to track the documents Mark had tricked me into signing. We discovered that Mark hadn't just put the house on the market, he had attempted to transfer the title into a holding company he controlled. But Mark was never as smart as he thought he was. He had missed a crucial clause in my late husband's will regarding the life estate of the property. I realized then that I didn't need to fight him to stay, I just needed to let him think he'd won until the trap was set, the long game. When Mark came to the facility a week later with a stack of additional medical forms, I knew they were actually the final closing documents for the sale of the house. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room. "Just some boring paperwork for the insurance, Mom," he lied, handing me a pen. I looked him straight in the eyes. I saw the greed, the desperation, and the total lack of remorse. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I smiled, complimented him on being such a good son for taking care of the details, and signed every single page with a flourish. "There you go, Mark," I said softly. "I hope this brings you everything you deserve." He practically sprinted out of the room, clutching the papers like a golden ticket. He thought he had just secured his fortune. In reality, he had just signed a series of documents James and I had carefully prepared to ensure that every cent from the sale would be diverted into a protected irrevocable trust that he couldn't touch for 25 years, the empty house. The celebration happened 3 days later. Mark and Chloe threw a farewell to the old house party for their friends, even though they hadn't told me. They used my expensive crystal, drank the vintage wine my husband had saved for our 40th anniversary, and bragged about their newfound wealth. I showed up unannounced. James drove me there. We walked into the house while the music was blaring and Chloe was showing off the renovation plans to a group of socialites. The music stopped when I walked in, not with a walker, but in my best silk suit, standing tall. "Mom? What are you doing here?" Mark stammered, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. "I came to join the celebration," I said, picking up a glass of my own wine. "I also came to introduce you to the new owners." "Well, the actual owners. Since you sold the house using a fraudulent transfer, the sale was voided, and I've sold it to a local historical society for a much lower price, and donated the proceeds to the nursing home's charity wing." The final lesson. The silence in the room was deafening. Mark tried to scream about the power of attorney, but James stepped forward, handing him a folder. "The POA was revoked 48 hours before you signed the closing papers, Mark," James said calmly. "And the insurance forms you had Sarah sign? Those were confessions of financial elder abuse. We have the recordings of you discussing the fraud in the hallway of the facility. Mark and Chloe were evicted from my life that night. They lost their down payment, their reputation, and eventually, Mark's business folded under the weight of the investigation. I didn't go back to that house. I moved into a beautiful independent living cottage by the sea, funded by the small portion of the sale I kept for myself. Sometimes, the best way to deal with people who treat you like you're invisible is to let them think they've won, right up until the moment you take the board away."